Can governments legislate for quality? Can you find a way of requiring quality in public services? I don't know if people have views on that.
I don't think you can legislate for it. I mean, you can't say, well, I mean, you can establish standards, but you can't make people comply just by virtue of passing an act of parliament. I think you need to look at a much wider range of incentives. I think something Gerald said is really interesting, which is that the democratic discipline is probably as rigorous from the point of view of politicians in particular, but public managers too, as the discipline of private markets. But we haven't quite found the way, the set of institutions that enable us to, if you like, unleash the power of citizens. Now, that seems to me to suggest that we need to intensify our democracy, if I can put it that way. It doesn't mean that we need to have people turning up to meetings to talk about the quality of the local hospital every day, but it does mean that we need to create a set of incentives for public managers to think really seriously about whether they are meeting the expectations of their citizens, and indeed how they can have a dialogue with their local communities which genuinely reflects whether quality is being delivered or not.
There is a discipline for us. I go out knocking on doors in my ward 2 nights a week regularly, talking to local people, and the things they talk to me about I try to reflect in, and it's parking, noisy pubs and dog crap, and if you can get those things right, you change, people's lives are a bit better. Those are the things that affect their lives day in, day out, every day, and there is some level of trust we get of getting the rest of it reasonably right. I know that's slightly disjointed, but it does concentrate your mind if you have to go and get re-elected on trying to concentrate on people's real desires about their local patch.
Can governments legislate for quality? Well, that's difficult, but they certainly can legislate against quality, can't they? And that's, I think, what we've seen with the last government's obsession with targets. You know, you hear people in public sector saying, I want to do a good job, but the whole system doesn't let me.
I mean, in a sense, government did legislate for quality with targets, and it was often against the wishes of the people, of the providers, and they would complain that they were being distorted and being driven in ways they didn't want to go. But quite often the politicians were responding actually to a public concern. I mean, waiting times in the NHS is a classic case. I mean, I do think choice played a role, patient choice played a role as well, but there's no doubt that targets were a very important driver in meeting a perceived and expressed public need in that context. So I think that we shouldn't, I mean, I'm slightly alarmed at the speed at which the present government is throwing out the target culture, although I do approve of its emphasis on choice and competition.
Well, personally, I do not believe that without the target, NHS waiting times would have come down as they did. I mean, like Julian, I think competition and choice had some impact, but it's quite hard to actually measure it.
But then choose them really carefully.
No, you have to choose them really carefully, and you mustn't have, you know, you can have 1 or 2.
We had at least 3,000
per
council imposed upon us from government, which is madness.
Yes.
I think if you try and run a sort of command and control system, you'll end up with, you know, you can just about measure compliance against a sort of lowest common denominator, but the risk is that you will completely stifle innovation, and it sort of leads to a mass production approach of public services, which I don't think is the route to competition, just trying to recreate the same thing everywhere.
There are a couple of hands up there, yes.
Nothing impacts on reputation quite like quality. Time to market, price do not impact on reputation in the same way that quality does. And if you think about it, every time you use quality, we normally have to put a noun after it: quality improvement, quality inspection, quality assurance, quality accreditations, and so on. So one of my passions somehow is to reposition what we do and describe what we do in our title, in our professional title, rather than an outcome. Engineers wouldn't dream of allowing themselves to be called product. People working in oncology wouldn't dare call themselves health. Why do we describe what we do as a profession in terms of an outcome? It's beyond me.
But isn't there a feedback loop? Aren't you talking about a feedback loop, you know, from customers back into the organisation, so that you then generate that continuous improvement? Isn't that what you're talking about, really?
Well, the 2 points I was trying to make is that quality defines reputation more than any other factor. So you have to improve quality if you wish to stay in business. What we have to do is position the unique activity that we undertake in support of protecting and maintaining and enhancing our reputation. And that tends to be, if I could substitute it for only one other word, although still incomplete, it would be assurance, because at least it's got the suggestion of a doing term. And assurance can embrace most of the activity that's embedded within our quality function.
I think that seems to me that works for quite a lot of people. My worry is you also need people to have the aspiration for quality. If you have none of that aspiration, there won't be anybody demanding quality.
The question you raised about whether we should be focusing upon the process, in some senses, of achieving quality or on quality outcomes, I think is a very interesting question. Because governments often, or certainly political parties in opposition, usually say it's dreadful that governments are focusing upon processes in trying to measure quality. What they should be looking at is outcomes and the rest of it. And you can see why. I mean, the sort of arguments that Nick was putting forward, I mean, that actually what we're really concerned is the health of the nation or the education of the nation, not the quality of the buildings in which the schools are put or whatever. In practice, of course, when governments get into power, what they find is that they have some control over processes, but actually outcomes are often rather beyond them. It's not very surprising at the end of the day that governments, when they get into power, find themselves scurrying back to look at process, to look at things like waiting times, which they can do something about, whereas actually outcomes are much trickier to focus on.
Catherine Bithell from the CQI. I think you're all in violent agreement that what quality is about is essentially the degree to which products and services meet customer needs and expectations or even exceed them. But why isn't its practice more widespread?
The simple answer is that organisations can succeed in their own terms at a level of mediocrity. And in the private sector, some of that is driven by the nature of the consumers that they're serving. And in the public sector, it's driven by bureaucracy and inertia and inappropriate incentives to managers to change their behaviours. The LSE, Stanford University and McKinsey published a study last year looking at performance in manufacturing across a range of OECD and emerging market economies. And they found that what made the difference was the quality of management, more than anything else. Frankly, it's not rocket science, it's just getting the basics right. But in this case, the basics is not just about command and control, it's also about engaging your workforce, listening to people internally, as well as listening to your customers.
Margaret Rooney, Chair of the Professional Policy Board of the CQI. I'd like to ask the panel, how can the Chartered Quality Institute, or how should the Chartered Quality Institute help the public sector?
Well, I suppose it's sort of an extension of the answer that I probably would have given to Catherine's question as well, which is that I agree. The reason it happens is because that they are the features of a monopoly, and that happens in private sector monopolies as well as public sector ones. But too many of our public services are still near monopolistic, so that's sort of the first thing. But in sort of servicing these bureaucracies, often what happens is that people, David Nicholson, Chief Executive of the NHS, often says that, people within the NHS should look out, not up. And that's what happens if you have a very centralised system, that people inevitably look up to the bureaucracy and service the needs that places on them, rather than looking out at the people using it. So I think sort of back to where we started really, it's that we need to have data out there so that people using public services can genuinely see what they're getting and how that compares with elsewhere. We need a plurality of provision so that people have some choice within it, and we need to empower the people using public services and prompts, questionnaires, that kind of thing. That's how we can do it.
As CQI, from the local government point of view, I think it would be very useful to have more contacts between yourself and local government improvement and development. It used to be called, until a couple of weeks ago, the Improvement and Development Agency, whose job it is to drive good ideas and good practice through local government.
Think of one thing that the coalition government might be able to do that would actually drive up quality at the same time as we are cutting costs that they maybe haven't done, or that they have done, they should put more emphasis on.
It does seem to me that we have to have a quite profound conversation about how we organise capitalism in the UK before we can begin to create a culture that enables quality professionals to do what they're very good at doing.
What could the government do better? I think probably they could do a lot worse than look at place-based budgeting. there is huge amounts of public sector money that is wasted by masses of different organisations trying to do the same thing.
But we need some transparency. We need some new ideas, an injection of new ideas into public services. And if we have that transparency matched with a right to bid, not just from the private sector, but from hopefully social enterprises and cooperatives, depending what they do with lots of different parts of the sector. If we have that kind of debate going on, where we have more ideas flowing around, I think some of the problems that we've faced for a very long time hopefully would become more obvious to solve, to improve.
I'll offer something that's, again, very, very broad, very conceptual, and that is an understanding, perhaps a cultural understanding of who we're doing this for. What are the services for? Who's it for? Is it for the providers of the service, or is it for the users?
Employee-owned organisations, and that might be quite an effective way of raising morale, raising outcomes, and improving the quality of our public services.
Clearly, maintaining or ideally improving quality in the cold climate is the sort of biggest single challenge, certainly facing the public services and to a large extent the private sector over the next few years. Can I thank you all very much for coming, for contributing, and can you please thank your panel for their excellent contributions.